Hey, everybody out there. This is your brother Garfield. And my sound. I forgot to do my sound. All right. So this is Brother Garfield. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we're doing the 20 for 20 scholars for the month of February, which is called Black History Month. We had three wonderful doctors and PhDs from different walks of life. Well, possibly not Dr. Robert Price, because, you guys both deal with the New Testament. But today, ladies and gentlemen, I have one of the persons that made me grow from a little boy to where I am today. And as far as knowledge, information in the New Testament from a different point of view, I would like to introduce everyone who's watching to Dr. Dennis Mcdonald. How are you today, sir?
I'm fine, thank you.
All right. Before we begin, Dr. McDonald, I would like for you to give us an idea of who you are, because the African American community, the conscious community, they're not familiar with your works like I am. I'm extremely familiar. There's a few here and there might know it, but as a larger scale, I want to introduce you to the African American community, the conscious community, and tell us a little bit about yourself, your upbringing, why you got into this type of studies, and so forth.
Let me begin by thanking you. I am aware of my white privilege, and yes, I'm a bleeding white liberal. And I'm so grateful to be invited to your Black History Month presentations. And I've been rethinking some of my work in light of the social struggles of African Americans, especially in this troubled time. And I really do think that my work has something serious to contribute to the struggles for liberation and identity in American history with pertaining to racial relations. So I want to start with that because I'm aware of the cultural situation we're in, and I don't want this to come off as a simply academic endeavor. I actually think it's a part of social struggle. So let me begin with that. I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian home. I went to Bob Jones University, which is famous for its racism and infamous for its racism. And the Bible was a way of me climbing out of that fundamentalism into a more generous understanding of the Christian religion. I don't consider myself a believer any longer. So I want your viewers to know that. But I love the Gospels, and I love them because of their amazing creativity and social context and struggle. I was a student at Harvard, got my PhD there in New Testament, but spent most of my classwork actually in classics. And I became fascinated, especially with Greek mythology and poetry. But I was convinced that that had very little to do with early Christian texts. Until I was working on the reconstruction of the text of the Acts of Andrew, that most people don't even know existed, but it's one of the most fascinating documents produced by the early church. Relevant to Black History Month, it was written in Egypt at the end of the 2nd century, probably right around the year 200. And it was called the Acts of Andrew to portray Andrew as an alternative to Greek heroes, Odysseus and Achilles and so on, and also Socrates as a philosopher. I didn't realize what I was working on. I didn't realize that there was that connection until I was working at a folklore institute at Indiana University, trying to identify maybe oral traditions that were informing this text. But there weren't any oral traditions. They were all literary allusions. it occurred to me just before I was to drive home to Denver that many of the episodes that I saw there reminded me of Homer's Odyssey. So I delayed my departure until I could get a paperback translation of the Odyssey, and unknown to the Highway Patrol of 5 states, I read the book on my way home. And I was astonished, Garfield, by what I saw. There were, in the Acts of Andrew, there are cannibals and shipwrecks and great feasts and monsters and so on. And those were all evoking the Odyssey. And I'll say more about the substance of the Odyssey later. And it took me quite a while after that to put together the text of the Acts of Andrew. And I also published a book called Christianizing Homer that is about this text. And that adventure began in 1984, almost 40 years ago now.
Wow.
And then, but during that time when I was working on this, Garfield, I thought that the Acts of Andrew was unique. It was the only early Christian text that had this ambitious project of rewriting Homer for Christian values. But I got up very early in the morning, made myself a pot of coffee, and gave myself a fresh reading of the Gospel of Mark that I was to lecture on later that day. And I was astonished by what I saw. The Gospel of Mark also has Jesus sailing the seas with companions that are not reliable, stilling the storm, encountering a savage from who lives in caves, which is similar to Polyphemus. He can change soldiers into swine the same way that Circe does. He visits with the dead in the Transfiguration story. And at the end of the book, his death imitates, and I'll say something more about this later, the death of Hector. And I was dumbfounded by what I saw, because at the time I had never, ever seen a book on the Gospels that made the slightest allusion to Greek mythology, let alone to Homer and Homeric epics. So I gave my old presentation in the Gospel of Mark and decided I would give myself a span of time to explore to what extent Mark could have been involved in imitating the Homeric epics. And during that time, I was repeatedly dumbfounded by what I saw. Not only that, but later on, I realized that Virgil in his Aeneid had imitated many of the very same stories that Mark imitates, so that the core poetry of the Roman Empire that sustained the Augustan age imitated the same texts in Homer that Mark did. And Mark is a competitor with Virgil, I think, in his imitations. Now, unfortunately, and let me say something about mimesis. Mimesis is simply the Greek word for imitation. It's a translation into Latin is easier for us to remember, imitatio, where we obviously get our word imitation. And it goes like this. In schools, students were saturated with successful literature. And there can be little doubt that Homer was the most important text that was used for education. And even though it was in poetry, people were to imitate it in prose in order to learn how to write. So, for example, a teacher would tell a student, I want you to write a story about a shipwreck and use as your model Odyssey chapter 5. Or I want you to write a story about the pathos of the death of a young soldier. So to do that, I want you to reread the end of the Iliad and the death of Hector and use that as a model. Don't retell the story, but tell a new story that uses some of those motifs. So this mimesis was widespread in antiquity. The problem for us moderns includes two issues. One, we don't know Homer. It's not taught in our schools very much. In fact, it's got a diminishing interest even in classics, which I find to be really quite tragic. The other is that mimesis is harder to spot because it's a more literarily creative enterprise than editing something or reproducing a text or telling the same story of the text, especially when it moves from poetry, let's say Homer, to get to prose. Though we know ancients did it, it's often difficult for us to spot it. In order to do that, I came up with 7 criteria, and I want to go through them before I let you ask a question of it, Garfield.
Hey,
And
1 second, Doc. Before you go into the criteria, because I do have it in front of me. I think I'm missing one. But I do want to ask you this before you go into, because what you're saying is fascinating right now. I want to ask you a personal question. Before you went to Harvard, before you went into this venture of trying to compare the imitations between writers, who were the authors or the writers that influence you in any way, shape, or form as far as this imitation connection?
before I went to graduate school at Harvard, I was involved in the civil rights movement. And I helped start the Sojourner magazine. I don't know if you're familiar with Sojourners,
Yes,
but
I am.
Jim Wallace and I were roommates for 3 years.
Wow.
And I actually funded the first Post-American, which was the forerunner of the Sojourner magazine. So I was very involved in the anti-war movement. I had come out of Bob Jones, translated the entire Greek New Testament for myself before going on to seminary, and found that the theological work that I was expected to do in graduate school had little to do with the text I was reading. And so I wanted to pursue that in graduate work. So during the time before going to Harvard, some of the people who were important to me were Martin Luther King Jr., James Baldwin, and I'm not just trying to inflate Black History Month, but these were important authors to me. But so were sociologists who were giving a scientific understanding of what was going on in the culture at the time. Let's see, Noam Chomsky was important to me at the time. So I kind of saturated myself in leftist intellectuals. So anyway, that gives you some background.
Okay. All right. For some reason, I think you are frozen on the YouTube here on the StreamYard. I don't know if it's my connection, because yesterday we did have a problem.
No, it's not you. It's going across country. We have the same problem with Myth Vision.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to reboot or.
I don't want to reboot. I mean, I do have time today.
No. Let's continue.
All right.
What I have to say is much more important than my face. So.
I hear that. All right. So let's get to the criteria. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, there's a book called The Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark. And in reading this book, there's a couple of criterias that Dr. Mcdonald uses to judge his probability of one text having a dependence on another text. In other words, his whole methodology. And he's going to go through the 7. I have 6 listed here, but we're going to go through the 7 and break it down. But go ahead, Doc.
Oh, that's fascinating, because the seventh criterion I added after that book because of criticisms of my method. So I'll tell you what that is in a moment. The first criterion is accessibility. Was the text targeted for imitation available? Was it popular? Were there copies around? Was it written earlier? Do we know that in the circles that the person from that was writing would have been available? The text would have been available to them. The second also has to do with the intended model, and that's called analogy. Were other people imitating the same book, or am I making a judgment simply about the book that I know? And in no texts in antiquity were more available than the Homeric epics. To give you an example, we have over 600 different manuscripts of the Homeric epics. We have only 5 of the Jewish Bible. So the people learned how to read by reading Homer. We also know of many imitations of the Homeric epics. I've already mentioned Virgil, but we have many others. So the Homeric epics satisfy accessibility and analogy. The next 4 or 5 similarities have to do with the parallels between 2 works. And there you have it on the screen. Density, the number of parallels between texts. Order, the sequence of those parallels. Distinctiveness of the special features of the stories that link them. And interpretability or intelligibility, the capacity of an original text to make sense of some detail in the new work. Now, my critics said, why is it, Dennis, if this is their strategy, that nobody in the history of interpretation saw these parallels? And I've added a 7th criterion, and it's called ancient recognition. Do we have evidence that people from antiquity saw the similarities between the Gospels and Greek poetry? And in fact, we have lots of examples of it. And so that's something I had to add after that book. By the way, I do want to read something from that book that I think captures what I saw in reading Mark that morning in preparing my lecture. And it goes like this. It's a short paragraph. Mark's Jesus shares much with Hector, and even more so with Odysseus. Odysseus and Jesus both sail seas with associates far their inferiors, who weaken when confronted with suffering. Both heroes return home to find it infested with murderous rivals that devour the houses of widows. Both oppose supernatural foes, visit dead heroes, and prophesy their own returns in the third person. A wise woman anoints each protagonist, and both eat last suppers with their comrades before visiting Hades, from which both men return alive. In both work, one finds God stilling storms and walking on water, meals for thousands at the shore, and monsters in caves. Furthermore, Mark's dependence on the Odyssey suggests elegant solutions to some of the most enigmatic and disputed aspects of the gospel. Its depiction of the Gospels is inept, greedy, cowardly, and treacherous. Its interest in seas, meals, and secrecy, and even its mysterious reference to the unnamed young man who fled naked at Jesus' arrest. But Mark did not steal from the epics. He transvalued them by making Jesus more virtuous and powerful than Odysseus and Hector. Like Hector, Jesus dies at the end of the book. His corpse is rescued from his executioner, and he is mourned by 3 women. But unlike Hector, Jesus is raised from the dead. Mark may have cut his literary teeth on epic, which might explain a major incongruity in his composition. Despite its rustic, at times barbaric Greek, the Gospel's literary achievement is brilliant. Some of Mark's brilliance, I submit, is Homeric radiation. So that's what turned me on to mimicist criticism. It was only later that I decided to go deeper into Virgil's imitations and the analogous imitations there. And so anyway, that's what mimicist criticism is about.
Okay. All right. Let's take a look at so we're dealing with Homeric epics and the Gospel of Mark. You guys saw the criteria and basically what Dr. Mcdonald used to judge the probability of a text's dependence on other works. What if you mentioned something about the feeding of a lot of people at the 5,000? Wouldn't that picture have a Jewish root to it? Or are you saying that the Jewish root of Elisha or Elijah feeding 100 people in the book of Kings, would you say that that was a dependent story on the epics, the Homeric epics? Seeing that story has to do with feeding and fish and bread or whatever they talked about in the Old Testament?
Well, Garfield, that's a good question. And that's how people frequently have understood the text. And let me begin by saying my statements about imitations of the Homeric epics does not rule out Jewish influence. That is, here in the Gospels, we have a cultural hybrid. And so we can have parallels between the Jewish scriptures and Homeric epics, and that's not a problem. But then we need to dig further. Which of the two stories has the more details in common with the gospel story? And in this case, there can't be any doubt that you have more parallels in Homer than you have in the Bible. Let me give you some examples. The feeding of the 5,000, the story in book 3 of the Odyssey goes like this. Telemachus, Odysseus' son, and the goddess Athena as mentees, go to Pylos, and they come across a feast at the shore for 4,500 all men. They're seated in groups of 50, that is 9 different groups of 50, and they're roasting oxen for a great feast to Poseidon at the beginning of the sailing season. Then they eat lavishly, and then they have a conversation about Telemachus' father, Odysseus. So in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus and his disciples sail by boat to land. There are not 4,500, but there are 5,000, and they are all men. Women are not there in the Gospel of Mark. And that happens also in the Odyssey. Then they sit in groups of 50s and 100s. Now, Nestor was able to feed these crowds because of his great wealth, but Jesus was able to feed them by multiplying the loaves. And that's where the Jewish side comes in, where the prophets can multiply food for hundreds, but not thousands. So this would be a good example of a cultural hybrid story. But of the two stories, the narrative features are far closer to Odyssey Book 3 than they are to the biblical histories.
Wow. Let me ask you a question. Is imitation a bad thing?
Oh, no, it's a marvelous thing. We tend to think that imitation means plagiarism. For antiquity, mimesis can be plagiarism, but more often than not, it is skillful remanipulation of a narrative for new purposes. It's a creative enterprise. It's not a pedantic enterprise. And especially with cultural tensions, you want to retell the story that is dominant in your culture and retell it in a way that shows that your culture is better. An example that I like to give is that when my daughter was young, a friend of ours gave her a book called Sleeping Ugly. Well, Sleeping Ugly is obviously a play on Sleeping Beauty, but the point is to have a feminist reading of the fairy tale instead of the male-dominated one, so that there's a punch that comes with mimesis. It's cultural transformation, it's rivalry, it's and you can see this in Virgil. Virgil wants to rewrite Homer because he wants to show that Aeneas is better than the likes of Odysseus and Achilles, the Greeks.
Okay. All right. So imitation not being a bad thing, a good thing. You draw your own conclusion, audience. I say this: if these stories being imitated, do these stories make the role players in the stories, the major players, I'm talking like the disciples, Jesus, and all that stuff, does it make them not historical?
We talked about this off the air earlier. Yes, I'm a big believer in the historical Jesus, but I'm also a big believer that the historical Jesus was mythologized in order to make him compete in the religious marketplace in the Greco-Roman world. And it's very tricky to sift out the historical from the mythological. So, no, I believe that not only there was a historical Jesus, but there were also 12 disciples. We have that attested already in Paul. But most of the stories, and in fact, this may be scandalous and you may not want to go there. I think there's almost no narrative in the Gospel of Mark that he didn't receive either from the Lost Gospel Q or from the Homeric epics. In other words, I think there's very thin evidence for any of the narratives in the New Testament.
Wow. That's very interesting. I actually was going to ask you a question about the purpose of imitating the stories. And I'm glad you brought that up about the Greco-Roman world. Would Christianity be as popular as it is if it wasn't for them writing this way? Because you have an audience, the Gentile audience, who would have to receive this message, and it would have to be a friendlier message, or a message that would be written in a way that would be familiar to the folks to join this new religion. Would you agree that the writing was done on purpose for this sake?
I'm going to divide your comments into two parts. The first is, you asked whether Christianity would have taken off as such a vital religion if these mythologizing stories were not there. And I think there's no doubt that it would not have survived in the same way. That these stories are riveting, they're captivating, they're exciting, and much more so, let's say, than what you'd find in the Q document or what we can recover in the epistles of Paul. So I think there's no doubt that these Gospels are largely responsible for the success of the Christian movement. The other piece that you put there is I got the impression, Garfield, that you're asking, did the authors write this in order to win converts of Greeks and pagans? I don't think so. I think what these authors were doing is writing for believers by saying that our Lord can do what the Greek heroes and deities can do. Poseidon can walk on water, Jesus can walk on water. Odysseus can visit the dead, Jesus can visit the dead. So that these books are written to establish social identity for the community they're talking about. I'm sorry for the pun, but it's a conscious community that they're creating over against the outsider whose stories they're not only appropriating, but rivaling. So Odysseus blinds a caveman. Jesus exorcises a caveman. Which one's showing more compassion, right? Jesus dies a heroic death. Hector died a heroic death, but Jesus is the one that came back to life. So that this is written for believers to fortify them and to help them identify who their Lord is over against the religious characters of their environment.
Okay. All right. What about mythologizing? Mythologizing. I always have a problem with that word. Mythologizing Jesus, from Jewish teacher to epic hero.
I actually wrote this book for my grandchildren. And I intended to take the more scholarly versions of my work and to condense it into something that they could read and enjoy. And in fact, my, at that point, 13-year-old grandson helped me write it, because I would read something to him and he would tell me what vocabulary was too esoteric, or he didn't understand this. And so it's an attempt to be an entree into this material. You probably noticed yourself that reading this book was much easier than reading the Homeric epics and the Gospel of Mark.
Right.
And the works that came out after that are even more difficult to digest. So I wanted to put something out there that even my grandchildren could read and appreciate. And in fact, I might want to read something to you from the very end of it where I talk about that. I'm not going to read much. I know that the medium isn't fond of people reading at them, but you can't see my face anyway, so maybe this will work.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the page.
In the meantime, thumb up the video, family. Share the show, like the show. Show some love.
I did not write this book primarily for Christians. I wrote it for my young grandchildren, Henry and Oliver Reno and Nika Mcdonald, who no doubt will make their own decisions about religion, politics, spiritual and intellectual inspiration, and ethics. I do not want to make them Christians. On the other hand, I don't want to deprive them of a morally mythologized Jesus. Henry, now 11 years old, long has been enthralled by Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, Ben 10, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Doctor Who, and Transformers. He and I have spent many hours reading about Percy Jackson, the demigod son of Poseidon, who, with other teenage demigods at Camp Half-Blood, prevails over various adventures, many of which were inspired by Greek mythology. Mimesis of the Homeric epics is alive and well. The book at hand germinated from these readings, and Henry even helped in its creation by flagging confusing terms and selecting episodes. In addition to his other superheroes, he's now familiar with one created long ago to embody justice, courage, and compassion to rival the likes of Heracles, Athena, Achilles, and Odysseus. When my son Julian was Henry's age, he asked me what I taught my students. So I suggested that for 1 week at bedtime, I would tell him 2 stories, one from Homer and one from the Gospels. We then would compare them. At the end of the week, I asked him which myths he liked better, the Greek or the Christian. His response was immediate and univocal. The Greek, of course. Although I was teaching at a Christian seminary, I had to agree with him. On the other hand, we both recognized that Jesus was a better hero to emulate. Today, he's a nurse, loving Father Tanika, and one of my heroes of healing and compassion. This book is a continuation of those bedtime tales and was written to show that the mythologized Jesus is too inspiring, exemplary, and engaging to be captive to the Christian church.
Wow. Wow. I want to say press repeat. Press repeat on that one. Let's go back to Homer epics for a second.
Yeah.
Mark 3:17 talks about Boanerges, or the sons of thunder. Can you elaborate on that connection with the Homer epics as far as the book of Mark, please?
The Boanerges is an awkward transliteration of apparently.
I want to know what's the I have a because somebody else heard about the line, so there's a broker.
Mm-hmm.
Captain Fico that had the same lines as you told me.
Which lines? Which ones?
He had TransUnion for $30,000.
Give me a second, sis. Give me a second.
Okay.
Yes, my mic was giving a little bit of trouble. All right. Can you hear me, Dr. McDonald?
Yeah, should I start again?
Yeah, go ahead. Start again.
Boanerges is an awkward transliteration of sons of thunder in Aramaic. And Zeus is the god of thunder, and he had 2 children who were called the Dioscuri, that is the boys of Zeus, and that is Polydeuces and Castor. They were famous as sailors. They were among the Argonauts, for example. And James and John are fishermen. They have a common name. They're almost treated as twins. So they are the Dioscuri equivalent. They are equivalents to the Dioscuri. One of the things fun that's about the Dioscuri, and by the way, the constellation Gemini is the Latin form of the Dioscuri. So those 2 stars are the Dioscuri. Anyway, Polydeuces and Castor are twins, but one has Zeus as a father, Polydeuces, and the other has a mortal, Tyndareus, for a father. And so one is mortal and the other immortal. When Castor dies, Polydeuces is so upset that he asks Zeus if they can share one mortality, or so share one more immortality. So on alternating days, Castor is dead and Polydeuces is alive, and on the next day, it's the reverse. Polydeuces is dead and Castor is alive. In the Gospel of Mark, it's James and John who ask for special considerations in the afterlife. They want to sit on Jesus's right and his left hand in his glory. When the Dioscuri are depicted in ancient art, they often are on either side of a seated deity. And we can see this in quite a bit in ancient art. So this is a good example of a significant name getting used to identify a character. In the same chapter, Garfield, we have Judas Iscariot. Nobody prior to Mark ever was called Iscariot, and it probably comes from the word into the city, the Kyriota. And he is the villain equivalent of Melanthius in the Odyssey, Odysseus' slave, who betrays him to the suitors. Those significant names are pointers to the alternating character, the corresponding characters in the Odyssey.
Okay, beautiful. What about the sleeping heroes and the storms at sea? That seems to be something that's familiar with the Homer epics as far as a tradition in the Greek culture. So that, again, you talk about accessibility. That story is accessible. That's one of the things, the sequence of events. And so if we go back to that different criterias, we see that what you're saying is actually being, the methodology you're using is making a lot of sense. Can you talk about the sleeping heroes and the storms at sea?
Sure. Odysseus has gone to the island of Aeolus, the god of winds. And he told him stories about the Trojan War, and Aeolus was so grateful that he gave Odysseus a bag of winds. So if the weather was not good for his ship, he could unleash the winds into the sails and get home. And he was just fine with that. He was about ready to put into the harbor at Ithaca when he fell asleep on the ship, and his crewmate said, "Oh yeah, a bag of winds. He's actually bringing treasure home. Let's open that bag and divvy the treasure up among ourselves before we get home." So they open the bag of winds, and it unleashes a hurricane, and it drives the ship all the way back to the island of Aeolus. So Odysseus says to Aeolus, here's what happened. Can you give me another bag of winds? And and by the way, I think that's enough. He says, no, you're accursed. So in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is on a ship. He falls asleep like Odysseus fell asleep. A hurricane erupts, and Jesus scolds the disciples when he gets up and said, "You must have little faith. Why couldn't you, settle the storm?" So instead of being driven back to Aeolus and his island, Odysseus gets up and himself stills the storm, playing the role of Aeolus. So Mark ends his story by saying, having the disciples say, "Who is this that even the winds and the sea obey him?" And a reader sensitive to the background would say, who is he? He's like Aeolus. He's the god of the winds and the sea.
Wow. That's very interesting. Very interesting, ladies and gentlemen. And what I like about your work, you started a whole way of looking at the Gospels, and you used the methodology. But why are you having these books out and you're teaching at institutions of learning? What was the reception by your co-workers and teachers who were New Testament scholars?
I was not surprised that Christian believers would have trouble with my work, because it says that these are not historical stories, that they're stories of evangelism and social identity, so that there's a mythologizing to them. I was really quite surprised that the scholarly community has resisted it so thoroughly. And a simple answer would be, because if I'm right, almost everybody in my field's wrong. I'll just have to say it that way. And wow. I think they know it, and I think they're protecting their territory. Now, but I don't think it's personal to me. I've actually written this up, and it's going to appear in a publication that I'm hoping to make as a PDF and make it widely available, on how scientific revolutions fail, and then thrive. And it goes like this. All scientific communities have education for their people. They have tried experiments and what one might call normal science. But sometimes in science, there's an unwelcome fact, an inconvenient truth that violates the paradigms that people have used for making sense of things. And there are certain strategies one uses to protect one's guild of science. And one is to deny the evidence. Another is to try to accommodate the evidence into standard procedures. Another is to attack the methodologies. And all of those have happened to me. Most of the time, my work gets ignored on the assumption that early Christians were not sufficiently educated and sophisticated to know how either to imitate Homeric epics or to read the Gospels mimetically. But then that's not a successful argument. So when they do argue it, then they argue it on the basis of the methodology. The parallels aren't good enough. No one has seen these parallels before, and so on. What it takes for a scientific revolution to take place is when the number of inconvenient truths that are not satisfactorily answered in the discipline pile up. And so it's not a one-off that can be absorbed into the dominant methods. There are enough inconvenient truths to require a new paradigm, a new science. Now, usually it's younger people like yourself who are willing to take a gamble on the new paradigm because their teachers and other people like myself, I'm 74 years old, have benefited too much from the old paradigm.
Wow.
So Max Planck says of his own scientific work, I don't expect my colleagues to agree with me. My theories will only take place when they're all dead and a new generation of interpreters comes along. Now, I'm not happy that my colleagues and I are all going to die from this generation. But I think it's interesting that I discovered mimicist criticism in my youth. I was 38 years old. And the people that I see that are taking hold of this are, in fact, younger people like yourself who say, hey, this is fascinating. I wonder if there's any validity to it. Let's run with it and see where it goes. But in the field, people are, I think, threatened by it.
Yeah. You know, I'm kind of like in a conundrum here, because in the conscious community, you have Bible believers who say the Bible is the word of God. Some people say, hey, we're part of the 12 tribes from Jacob. You know, some people take the New Testament as absolute truth. Then on the other hand, you present a case that there's a lot of Greek influence on the New Testament. Now, the other side that's in the conscious community is the folks that say, no, it's this is not the writers of the New Testament. They're basically taking stories from Egypt and presenting it in a sense of the in the biblical text. But what you have actually done now is open up a whole vacuum where this Greek information is now filling a void that the Egyptian information couldn't. It's actually, which I didn't subscribe to, but I always say the Greco-Roman influence on the New Testament is so obvious. It's unbelievable. But what do you say for both sides? The side that say, hey, it's an Egyptian connection, the side that says it's the word of God. and with your Greek information pointing this out, I don't think anyone has actually laid out a better, for lack of a better term, the imitations. I don't think anyone has done that.
When I was thinking about preparing for this, Garfield, I was trying to articulate for myself again, what are the tire meets the road advantages or challenges of this position? And so this is a direct answer to you that I've been thinking about. The one thing is that I would challenge your colleagues who are the Bible is the Word of God folks to reevaluate that, and that actually saying that the Bible is the Word of God in a historically reliable way is not very liberating. And it's not very intellectually responsible, and it creates all kinds of problems. Put it away that a Jewish rabbi friend of mine said, he doesn't understand Christian evangelicals because they have to say the Bible's the inerrant word of God, and then they spend all their time explaining how to get around its difficulties. He said, we in the Jewish community say, rather, no, the Bible is the word of the Jewish community, and look at all the wonderful things that we have here. So that instead of trying to solve the problem of inconsistencies, you dwell on the wisdom. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to be found in these texts by saying that these are not the words of God, but they're the words of human being that are struggling to make meaning in life the same way we are. But what then is the positive advantage, let's say in Black History Month, for looking at these texts mimetically? And I think it has to do largely with the Black Church's ongoing and estimable commitment to social change, to compassion and inclusivity. When you compare the stories in the New Testament to those in Homer, Jesus is far more compassionate. He's inclusive. He's not violent. And the story of his resurrection is a story of hope and divine vindication. So instead of spending our time trying to explain away the problems in the text and to say that it all must fit together somehow, I'd rather say, look at this wonderful collection of stories by human beings who are trying to make sense of the world like we are, and they share our values and they share our commitment to social change, to make it more compassionate, to make it more inclusive, to make it, I'm preaching now, brother, but I think there's a huge advantage to understanding the Gospels is engaged in cultural struggle. And Jesus is the hero of compassion and change. So that he's, I can go on and on about it, and I can give some other examples. But I think mimesis has a great deal to offer the Black Church in its own struggles for social justice, because that's what early Christians were trying to do in the Roman Empire. And they reappropriated and imitated the dominant stories of their culture in order to show that their Lord is more compassionate.
Yeah. I mean, even you find even in the time period of the Ptolemies, you find Egyptian writings talking about a new pharaoh that would come and save them, and you find this type of teaching that you actually see in the Gospels too. So there's always a struggle, and even within our time here, you look at a Harriet Tubman, you look at a David Walker, you look at a Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner. They're using the Bible in a way to free themselves physically And then now that we're no longer physically slaves in bondage, you have the Christian church evolved to a more of a, afterlife teaching, more of a freedom of the mind and moving to the hereafter and so forth, moving to heaven. But moving forward, do you consider, because you said something earlier that might cause a lot of controversy, you don't see Mark as having any real story in it, something historical. What about the other gospels, John, Luke, or Matthew? Do you see anything historical in those gospels?
When I say they don't have anything historical, I mean anything of historical worth that they did not inherit from the lost gospel Q. And I know that that's a big debate, and a lot of people don't think there was a Q document. I'm convinced there was. But I think that the amount of information that we have about the historical Jesus embedded in the Gospels in the New Testament derive from a lost gospel Q, but they add very little historical information beyond that. Let me go back, though, Garfield, if I might, to talk about Afrocentrism, the Black Athena, the African roots of Western culture, and so on, and how that works with mimesis criticism. Mm-hmm. It works both positively and negatively, and it goes like this. One of the great advantages of the Afrocentric understanding of antiquity is it shows that much of Greek mythology and religion has African analogies and, in some cases, roots. One of the problems is that is sometimes articulated as a one-directional dependence. That is, that things come from Africa into Greece or the Aegean and not the other way around. And what we know is that, in fact, things were moving back and forth, back and forth, back and forth all the time. So it was more of a reciprocal relationship than it was a unidirectional dependence. So the upside of that is that much of what we find in the Odyssey, for example, has potential relevance to Egypt and Africa. The earliest reference we have to Ethiopians, of course, appears in the Odyssey, when these are the people that live at the rising of the sun and at the setting of the sun. We also have Menelaus spending time in Egypt after the Trojan War. So it's clear that the nautical culture that produced the Odyssey was familiar with all parts of the Mediterranean and Ethiopian culture to some extent. Here's the downside of it. The Odyssey is also one of the first texts we have that is clearly racist and talks about Black slaves. And I don't know that this has ever been properly given credit in a shameful way. Odysseus has 3 slaves. One, the older man, is named Dolius, and he has 2 children. The boy is Melanthius, and Melantho is the girl. They're both slaves. We know they're Black because the word Melanthius and Melantho both in Greek mean black. Our word melatonin is related to it, the creating of black sleep or whatever. And their father's name Dolius means the deceitful one, which is often claimed of slaves who are trying to outwit their master and so on. So that on the one hand, we know from the Odyssey that you have cultural exchange around the Mediterranean and cultural exchange between Egypt and Greece. There's no doubt about it. But we also know that there was already at that time, in at least the 7th century BCE, black slaves in Europe. So this is a part of the larger cultural context of the New Testament that sometimes isn't understood.
Wow. That's huge. All right. So we've been on the air for over an hour. If anyone in the audience would like to ask Dr. McDonald a question, now would be the time. Somebody's joking. Does he believe Jesus existed? You know what? Let me pose that question to you in this way. Because a lot of the folks in the conscious community who are non-believers, they don't believe Jesus is historical. What would you say to those people?
Well, ironically, even though I believe in the mythologizing Jesus, I'm a staunch believer in the historicity of Jesus, because there is in the New Testament a Jewish teacher who is interested in a transformation of Jewish law, opening up the Sabbath to gleaning and healing and so on. And that is independently attested in Paul, who also is interested in reassessing Jewish law to include Gentiles. And there's a passage in Josephus who talks about the brother of Jesus, James, who's executed because he's transgressing Torah. So some of the information in the New Testament about Jesus rings true. Another is that there's a lot of information about Jesus in the New Testament that is not theologically significant. It's not mythological at all. Paul knows that Jesus had 12 followers. The name Nazareth it's an obscure village. Why talk about Jesus from Nazareth? Why make him dependent on John the Baptist, whom we definitely know existed? So I think that it's going too far. It's one thing to say that the early church mythologized Jesus. It's quite another to say that they fabricated him. And instead, it's very much like, I think, the way that the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. has exploded. And that we have stories about him and his travels and his family and so on, that in some cases we would question whether they're historical, but no one's going to doubt that he existed. There are other examples too. By the way, that there's a whole branch of sociology now called fan fiction, and it talks about how individuals have their legacy protected and expanded and challenged by later people.
All right. Let me see who else has a question here. Let me see. All right. How do you understand the early followers of Jesus in context outside of the biblical text? How do you look at the early followers without thinking about it from a biblical perspective, meaning that early 2nd century? How do you see them in a Greco-Roman world and what was going on? So, because they definitely subscribed to the Jewish law because they were persecuted. They didn't want to worship Roman gods and so forth. So in a Greco-Roman sense, if they imitated Greco culture, I mean, Greco culture was, they didn't mind worshiping other gods. So what was it about Christianity that made them get persecuted?
It is directly related to Judaism, but not entirely to the whole law. The part of Judaism that stuck with early Christians is a kind of what we now call monotheism. The ancients might have called it henotheism. That is, that the community is to be faithful to one deity and not to all the deities. And so Christians differ with each other dramatically on theology, but they usually don't on the question of having one God. The issue with Christian Gnostics is they don't think the one God is the God of the Jews, because the God of the Jews creates a world that is full of death and hardship and violence. So the God of the Bible is not the highest God. That's one of the primary differences, but they do have a sense of one deity. In Roman mythology, which it depends on Greek mythology to a large extent, but the Romans give it a different twist. In order for the empire to thrive, the gods have to be united in supporting the empire. And that's why they would be worshippers, Roman worshippers would be fastidious about sacrifices or building temples or public prayers to the deities. So having only one deity and shunning the gods of the Romans was considered to be a threat to the empire and to their culture. And so that was the primary reason that early Christians apparently were persecuted. They also, though, had different social connections. They dealt with issues of sexuality somewhat differently. They were more prone in some areas to manumit slaves, for example, or they cared for the poor in a different way other than the empire. So there were a lot of differences between them. By the middle of the 2nd century, almost all believers in Jesus were Gentiles. And Luke's gospel represents a transition toward that when you have the Acts of the Apostles added to it, where Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles and so on.
All right, so I got another question. All right, Garfield, if Jesus was historical, but the stories about him are not, then what do we really know about him? Then he put in parenthesis conundrum.
Well, I guess I could read you something that I wrote on that topic, but I don't have it immediately in front of me. It's the material that we can tease out of correspondences between the Q document, Paul, and Josephus, which is not very much. But we can say that Jesus was a Jewish teacher who ran afoul of the religious authorities by having a different and a more robust understanding, a flexible understanding of Jewish law that allowed for healing on the Sabbath. It emphasized love and justice as opposed to legal obedience to tithing and so on. So Jesus probably was in fact executed because of his radical understanding of Judaism and trying to open it up to the margins of society. So, for example, I consider the Q document when it says, Jesus says, I did not come to call the righteous but sinners, and he eats with tax collectors and sinners, to be an indication of Jesus's attitude toward the law, to take care of the socially marginal.
Okay. All right. Let me see what we're looking at here. Let me get some more questions. What was the Greeks' idea on a heaven? Someone asked that earlier. I missed that. Did the ancient Greeks have a heaven?
It's hard to put into a simple formula. Most Greeks, and I think this is fair to say, did not believe in an afterlife at all. The afterlife in Homer was primarily Hades and a place of punishment called Tartarus. But even Hades was an awful place. So Achilles says, I would rather be a slave to a poor man in life than to be Lord of all the dead, for whom there's no joy. But there is a place of punishment called Tartarus, where we have Tantalus and others being eternally tormented. There is in Homer, though, the Isles of the Blessed. That is an island where after death, a few individuals are taken for eternal bliss. But the idea of heaven and hell comes more out of Judaism than it does out of the Greco-Roman world. Then you have Platonism and the immortality of the soul, and so it's just hard to be univocal.
Right. You know, it's funny. We're talking the whole time, and the primarily 99% of the audience is agreeing with you. But the minute you say, you imply that you believe Jesus is historical, they start disagreeing with you, which is what the Pastor Bennett just posted in the audience. It's kind of funny. And there's this thing like about you can't trust Josephus because of what happened with the Antiquities part 18 or whatever. And so that means that one incident that may have been a forgery, let's just throw all of Josephus out. So when you mentioned Josephus and James a while ago, they're like, oh, we can't trust Josephus. But I think a lot, you know, I don't know what to say about folks and the historical Jesus. It's like folks want us to have like a DVD video or something, you know, of Jesus of 2,000 years ago. And even that won't be enough. So we have a whole folks in our community that don't think he's historical.
Okay,
So,
let me go back to Josephus just as a kind of a scholarly note. The notice about Jesus in chapter 18 clearly is a Christian expansion. But in that context, Josephus is talking about Jewish troublemakers, and I think he may have mentioned Jesus among those troublemakers, and that wasn't good enough for Christian scribes who came along and clearly doctored it up. And the reason I say that is in book 20, 2 books later, we find him saying, and the brother of Jesus, named James, and some others were executed in a kind of lynch hearing before the Sanhedrin for disobeying Jewish law. And other faithful Jews objected to it. So now there are lots of Jesuses in Josephus, but how many Jesuses would have had a brother named James and others who are identified with him who are disobedient to Torah? And Richard Carrier and I disagree a lot on whether that second Josephus reference is of any use or not. I think it's very interesting. And I think it's consistent with what we see about early traditions about Jesus elsewhere, namely his challenge to Jewish law. And the 2 arguments in favor of it, one is it's not James, the brother of somebody named Jesus, but Jesus's brother, as if the reader knows who this Jesus is. And he has a brother named James, and he dies. And there are others who die too, and they're all accused of having an alternative attitude toward Jewish law. I just don't think that's made up. So enough about that. No, you're right that for some people, the image of Jesus has been so abused in the history of theology that they have what I would call a Jesus allergy, and there's no amount of inoculation or vaccines that can cure that. But what I would have to say as a historian is that there was a historical Jesus. He was Jewish. He was a Jewish teacher. He was a radical social reformer, and that got him killed. And maybe that's enough to say.
Yeah, definitely. I think the second statement with James and Jesus, I think even Tim O'Neill, who I'm going to have on, I think next Friday or the Friday after, I know he's an atheist and he goes into that a lot too. But I have Bart Ehrman coming on Monday. He's going to have his point of view. I don't really want to talk about the Jesus existence anymore because, there's enough work out there. And I think, as you said, the abuse of it has done so much to us psychologically. People are like, I don't want nothing to do with no Jesus.
I get it.
And you can leave the religion, but that don't mean you have to just throw all methodology out the door right now.
Right.
Let me see if there's any more questions. Let me see. Let me see. And it's funny, they agree when you're talking about that Greek connection. Oh, they love it. The minute you say, "Oh, I love Jesus," they don't like Dr. Mcdonald no more. Oh man, this is funny. This is just so funny. All right, let me see what question. Am I missing any questions? Let me see what's going on. Let me see. Oh, someone asks, what about Zoroastrian influences?
That's an interesting question, and it's been much disputed by people who are called history of religions types. And where we can see some Zoroastrian influence is in what we call Jewish apocalypticism, where you have a battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, for example. But it seems not to be an immediate connection. It seems to be a culturally mediated connection that's already there in Judaism. So when you have a Zoroastrian influence in the Gospels, it more likely is an indirect influence than a direct influence by Zoroastrians.
All right, this is a good question from Pastor Bennett. Garfield, hold on, let me put it on the screen. Garfield, does the doctor agree that many Christians and theologians in the first century, such as Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and so on, fought against the Christian-Greek connection? Well, first of all, Justin Martyr and Tertullian would be 2nd century, but I get what his point is. They fought against the Christian-Greek connection as far as evaluating the theology.
That's an interesting observation, because for Tertullian, yes, Tertullian was very much against Greek and Roman religion and understands Christianity to be far superior to it. Justin Martyr is actually a little more complex. On the one hand, he says, okay, you Greeks, you have deities who are born of virgins. You have deities who rise from the dead. You have deities who have miraculous powers of healing. We say the same things about Jesus, and yet you persecute us. So give us a break. We're doing what you do. So Justin sees similarities between Jesus and Greek mythology. And I actually use that at the beginning of my book, Mythologizing Jesus, to say that the similarities between Jesus and the Greek mythological heroes was recognized. On the other hand, though, it is clear that Justin thinks that Jesus is superior to those deities. So I think the issue of Tertullian, yes, he really wants to have a division between Jerusalem and Athens in his famous statement. But I think Justin Martyr is really a much more complex and fascinating example.
All right, I have a question. It's a silly question, but I'm gonna repeat what my brother Morpheus says anyway. What would be James, John, Matthew, and Timothy's name in the first century? We know that's the English rendition today. What would it be in the first century?
Okay, let's take a look at those four names that he gave. Timothy is obviously a Greek name. James, Jacobus, is Hebrew. John is Ioannis, that's Hebrew. And Matthias is also Hebrew. So there you have three names, and you have one Greek. And of course, the three names at the beginning that are Hebrew are disciples' names. And yes, there were people named those names. And in fact, the names Jacobus and Ioannis were very common.
Okay. All right. Any more questions, family, before we get off the air? I have a question. Was Jesus a Pharisee, and was the Davidic line recognized by the Sadducees, or did they see it as myth?
Okay, there are two questions there.
Mm-hmm.
Was the Davidic line recognized by the Sadducees, or did they see it as myth? No, Jews did not see their own epic tradition as mythological. They considered it as a part of their spiritual history. And I'm sure that they would have said that the Davidic line is important because the Sadducees are related to the temple cult and Solomon and so on. But the Q document does not call Jesus a Messiah and does not recognize the Davidic line. So let's stay with Jesus, a Pharisee. If we go to the Logoi of Jesus, or if you want to, just Matthew, forget about the Q document or the Logoi of Jesus. Let's just say Matthew. Jesus clearly is not a Pharisee. The Pharisees are his primary enemy. They're the ones who, in Matthew, prior to the chief priests and the Jerusalem crowd crucifying Jesus with the help of Romans, the Pharisees are the problem. And why are they the problem? Because they are sticklers for the law in a way that sometimes harms people. It harms people who are prostitutes. It harms people who are the poor. It harms people who are the socially marginal. It harms the hungry. So the Pharisees accuse Jesus of violating the Sabbath because he allows his hungry disciples to glean on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, no, the Sabbath was created for the human, not the human for the Sabbath. Or what about someone who needs healing? Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees are not very happy about it. And we have these woes in Matthew and Luke, which come from the Q document, in which Jesus says, "Woe to you Pharisees and lawyers, you hypocrites! You tithe the mint and the cumin, but you give up love and justice." And it goes on and on that way. So Jesus is allotted with Pharisees to the extent that he's concerned about Jewish law. But you have a saying in the Lost Gospel that's really quite remarkable. The law and the prophets were until John the Baptist. After that, it's the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God for Jesus is a much more compassionate, inclusive, open, and ethical rethinking of law than what you'd have with the Pharisees' commitment to Mosaic authority and obedience to all the. Let me give you one more example. In Deuteronomy, Moses says that God told him that you will live if you obey all the commandments that I command you this day and that are commanded in this book or in this speech.
Okay.
Jesus comes along and says, no, to live, all you need to do is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbors yourself. That is what it takes to live. Now, those who obey all the commandments should be rewarded for doing so. But not everybody in the kingdom of God can obey all of those little commandments. The commandment to live by is the love your God and your neighbor.
All right. I have a very good question here. Dr. McDonald, do you believe the Q document would have been in Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic?
It had to be in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Had to be in Greek.
All right. And by the way, too, with this whole Greek conversation, would you agree that the followers of Jesus were not really the greatest, the smartest guys in the world to have written the actual document?
Say that again. I thought you were going one direction. And
followers of Jesus weren't the smartest of smart people or the smartest people in the world to have actually written the New Testament based on your point as far as they're taken from Greek stories. I'm not saying they didn't know the stories, but the way how they would rewrite the stories with these Greek traditions, it would have to be somebody that's extremely intelligent to do that.
Yes, and that represents the second generation of Jesus followers, in my view. The Gospels are not written by fishermen or peasants. They're written by intellectuals, and intellectuals that are committed to doing right and having compassion and changing law. But they're intellectuals. But in, again, the Q document, but that means it's in the Synoptic Gospels too, Jesus says, I thank you, Father, that you did not reveal these things to the wise, but you revealed them to the simple, basically. And Jesus says, you are more blessed than kings and prophets, because to you it has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God. So, no, they were not the smartest people on the block. On the other hand, they were given esoteric wisdom, probably meaning Jesus's teachings about the kingdom of God. And so they understand things that only that people outside of the circle can only understand through parables. And this goes to the parable stuff. To you has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God. To the rest, it's going to be in parables, where I can tell these stories and maybe they'll catch on. But so the followers of Jesus seem to have been not the sharpest tools in the shed. On the other hand, those who ended up writing the Gospels were, in my view, intellectuals and fairly well educated. Okay.
Did they use amanuenses or secretaries to compose these texts? What about Q? Was Q a dictated text to a secretary?
We obviously cannot look over the shoulder of these authors and to see how they worked. And that's a huge question. And it's a wonderful one, Courtney. I wish we could answer it more definitively. And Mark Goodenacre and I have talked about that. He thinks that you can have an amanuensis or a secretary. I'm more likely to think, because the gospel authors repeat the earlier gospels verbatim, that they in fact had a copy of, let's say, I think Matthew had a copy of Luke in front of, Mark in front of him, and was copying it himself. And but it's not impossible to have an amanuensis or a secretary. They're just invisible to us.
Okay. Let me see what else. Anything that's interesting that we could talk about. Somebody asks, do you think Jesus is going to return? Don't answer that, Dr. Manal. Don't answer that. Please don't answer that one. Let me see. Go back to the source. Let me see. Do you think the disciples were illiterate? I think you answered that already. You answered that with your previous answer. Come on, guys, get some questions in before.
No. Let me address that one.
Okay.
Our understanding of literacy is different from ancient understandings of literacy. More people could read than could write, because writing was considered a technology, the same way that we would say we have computer skills for some people and other people are better orally, but we're all literate. So writing was a technology and was used largely for purposes of business transaction or governmental or legal issues. But more people could read. My own view is that I think Jesus had to be able to read, but I don't know that he could write. Although the Q document has him writing with his finger in the dirt, with the story of the woman accused of adultery. But the disciples probably were educated somewhat like Jesus. I think they may have been able to read, but it's unlikely that any of them could compose, as far as we can tell. And surely they're not the ones who wrote the Gospels.
All right, that's clear as day. What's your opinion on the whole 12 tribe concept?
I don't hold to it. The history of the loss of the tribes and their identities probably ended with the exile. So no, I don't buy it.
Okay. Someone asking, do you think Barabbas Bartholomew existed?
Barabbas?
Right.
No, I do not. And the reason is Barabbas means son of the father.
Mm-hmm.
And he is the alternative to another son of the father, namely Jesus. So the Jewish authorities in the Markan account prefer the execution of one son of God who's a thief and a murderer to the true son of God, who's Jesus.
Okay. All right, let me ask some questions. Oh man. Let me see. Who does the doctor believe the Jews are today?
I have two answers. One is that the answer that generally Jews hold, and the other is a more open issue. According to Orthodox Jews, Jews are those whose mother was Jewish. And I know that because my mother was Jewish. but her father, her mother was not Jewish, so she was not considered Jewish, even though she was raised in a Jewish environment. What I would say is that Jews are those who choose to be Jews and to own the wonderful traditions of Israel, not the state of Israel, but Israel, so that they are the ones to decide if they're Jews and not me. I would say the same thing about Christians. Who are Christians today? I would say Christians today are those who identify with the Christian tradition and call themselves Christian. And in my view, a Christian can be an atheist. I consider myself a Christian atheist. Now, because the Christian tradition is the one I identify with, and the values of the Christian tradition that I cherish most. But I don't believe in a God. But I believe that the tradition that I value has in it impulses to liberation and compassion that I fall short of, and I don't want to give that up.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Pastor Bennett has a question. How does the doctor reconcile a historical Jesus being made up of mythical writing? Does he not believe that Paul, John, Peter, their companions, literally what they believe they heard and saw as they say?
Well, Paul and Peter did not write gospels, and they certainly believed in a historical Jesus. And as far as we know, they didn't know about the mythical elaborations of Jesus. The Gospel of John is not written by the disciple John, but by John the Elder. And that's often misunderstood by Christian believers, but it's by the same elder who wrote the Johannine epistles, 1 and 2 and 3 John. That author seems to know about Matthew and Mark and ascribes to the mythological Jesus to that extent. But none of them denies the historical Jesus. So the beginning of 1 John says, what we have seen and held and heard, we hand on to you that you may have life. And I think he's referring to himself as someone who had known Jesus, but was not a part of the 12, and is handing on a legacy that is life-giving. And by the way, I would say that mythological writing is not the equivalent of making things up. It's a way of elaborating. So I'm not denying a historical Jesus. I'm just saying that the memory of Jesus went through a process of mythologizing.
Okay. All right. Let's see what else we have here. Any more questions? I don't know if you're equipped to answer this one. Does circumcision hold as a covenant without a ceremony in Jewish law?
I don't know how to answer it.
Yeah. I don't either. All right. Let me see what else we got. Why do the early church fathers, as well as Papias, attest to a Hebrew Aramaic gospel original if it was in Greek? I don't think any church fathers, I think Epiphanius, maybe, not early church fathers. They talk about a Hebrew gospel of Matthew, I think. Like certain Ebionites and early Christian Jewish groups had a book, but I don't think they attest that the original was in Greek.
Well, both of you are very knowledgeable about this. Beta Israel is right that Papias refers to a Hebrew Aramaic gospel, but he's never seen it. He doesn't know anything about it except that he thinks it once existed. He does say that two or more people translated it into Greek, and those are the texts he knows. And I think one of those is our Matthew, and the other that were contributed to Matthew. One is our Matthew, and the other is the Lost Gospel Q. But he and his informant imagined there was a Hebrew or an Aramaic gospel, but they never saw it. And it's more likely it was a conjecture to explain how you could have two gospels of Matthew that differed. And so they think the differences came from the translators. So, and your comment about it was really quite knowledgeable too, Garfield.
Right. I have a good question here for you. When do you think the high Christology about Jesus first emerged? First century and from Palestine, or later from pagan influences?
I think the high Christology is very early. I think you find it already in Paul, which is earlier than the Gospels. That Jesus is the Son of God. He is he'll return in victory. He's the one who was with God in the beginning, did not think it robbery to be equal with God, became humble and obedient to the death of the cross, and God highly exalted him. That's a very high Christology. So I don't think it's helpful to talk about low Christology to high Christology on a simple chronological continuum. I think it happens in different communities in different ways. But the mythologizing Jesus from pagan influences, as Courtney has mentioned, comes somewhat after Paul and after the destruction of Jerusalem to make Jesus more competitive for a Gentile context.
Okay. All right. Hey, Dr. Mcdonald, I'm going to let you go today. I mean, it's been a very, very interesting conversation. You taught me a lot today. And I want to say to you, it was an honor to have you as a guest. I think you have you are welcome to come on anytime, of course, with your new projects and whatever you're working on. If you do need a platform to come on, I'm here. I'm open to have you on whenever you would like to come on. You're open.
Let me say two things, if I might.
Yes, sir.
One is I'm working on a new gospel synopsis in English that includes two synopses, one of the synoptics and one just of the Gospel of John with its various stages, in which mimesis criticism and the Q reconstruction is all laid out. And I'm hoping to make that available free as a PDF, though it's going to be a huge work, about 400 pages. But the other thing I want to do, just two more comments. One is I want to thank you for having me at this important month. And then you and your viewers, whatever your background, I hope you have a good Black History Month and we all learn what we need to learn about getting along together.
All right. All right. Thank you so much, man. And I'll speak to you soon, or we'll email each other. But thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Garfield. Take care.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. So this was number 4 in our 20 for 20 Scholars tonight at 7 p.m. Tonight, right on Dagger Squad, we're going to have Dr. Josh Boyne talking about the Old Testament and talking about slavery and so forth. I know Pastor Bennett's going to be in the chat. Listen to this one. And of course, Pastor Bennett's going to be on February 19th. He's going to be on, I think, next week, Friday. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining. And peace and love. Spread the show. And have a good day. Peace. We're out of here.